All right. So good morning. Okay, and hope you guys all refreshed this morning. And today, you guys are going to stuck with me most of the time. All right. And so the mostly, till late afternoon, and Roger would take over and talk about financial statement. Okay, how to do financial statement with Excel in Elia. Okay, exciting stuff if you are doing the financial statement. And then he's going to talk about some work order plus stuff. And our conference will end at 4 p.m. today, not the original 9 p.m. we original plan. Okay, and but anyway, so the first subject, inventory report writer. So what is an inventory report writer? And it's not responding to me. Why this doesn't? Okay. So inventory report writer is actually in Elia we call it user-defined CSV. And so I call it inventory report writer. It's basically in spirit, okay? And this user-defined CSV originally, it was because I don't know how many of you know there is a database in Elia. It's called IAM location history, okay? And so you know that, right? So usually if you know the database really well, then you will know the IAM location history. Essentially, it is a 12-month bucket of data for a lot of useful information like the quantity sold, sales amount, cost amount, and also different information. And it can also including something like days out of stock. That's actually a very interesting concept, because how many days of your month, how many days in a particular month, this inventory is out of stock. That information requires calculate, obviously, okay? And then so we actually can use deferred processing to update that bucket and available in the location history. There's many useful information in that table. And then, many of our users actually is not aware of it, okay? And so we said we need to make that table more accessible. And so what we do is we combine the item master table and the inventory location table, inventory location history table, and say make it easy so then user can retrieve data. Now, many of our customer is projecting how many they should plan to buy or produce basing on the what they sell in the past, right? So this is one type of a sales forecasting model basing on your sales history to project your future demand, and then basing on that, and then you plan, say how many I should buy and what is my current on-hand status, etc. Now, so you need that information. You need the sales information, basically, okay? And and then you also need to know the on-hand information. And so that's our first attempt. And then, but as it goes on, and we found out that not only they need the sales, they also need to have other type of information. So we start to expand, a lot, okay? And then so then we start to expand this this information and then the availability, and we just pretty much got a lot of inventory related data. Doesn't matter whether it's sales history, on-hand information, anything related to the item, or another one is called available to promise. Okay, we get all of those information and then can be, put it in these places. And then officially we call user-defined CSV because it's not a hard-coded CSV like other report. You can define the CSV yourself, okay? And but this CSV, the nature of it is related to anything related to the item, okay? And so it's not a generic, CSV that say you can, it's not a generic that you can get it from customer, you can get it from, say, vendor. It's not like that, right? So it's a generic for the item-related information. So then it's feasible to call it as a specialized version of the report writer we call inventory report writer. Now, this man get it from in the, I don't know, in the old days, have you guys heard about something called a financial report writer? You guys heard about that term? F9, right? But there are other financial report writer other than F9. This is something called FRX, and those kind of different things. But their special focus is focusing on the general ledger side, right? And then they are not a generic report writer, okay? They're focusing on the financial statement. So this one is focusing on the inventory. Okay, so I call it an inventory report writer for this reason, okay? And then also, on the other hand, you said, okay, you have the export processor, right? So, you can also using export processor, which is a generic one. You can use export processor to get all sort of data. And then how about export processor? Well, export processor can do a lot of things, broadly in the generic sense. But export processor doesn't handle the inventory data as in depth. So inventory report writer, we do a lot of different things in the inventory area. So if you are a person in that area, and then this will become of great interest to you. And also you may say, okay, so you have shown me the report desk, right? And look like it's a great stuff. And I also use a Crystal and Excel query. And then I extract the Elliott data, including the item data. And then what's wrong with doing that, right? Well, so the main issue, okay, is any data in Elliott, if you can retrieve it relationally, meaning use a SQL statement, and if you know how to join the table properly, and then get the data out, okay, including inventory data out, if you can do that, then those are great tools. And but some of the data that you may like to have, it's not as relational as you can get, okay? And then so that's where inventory report writer come in. And inventory report writer can retrieve a lot of Elliott inventory related data that's not even relational, okay? And then we can just make it available to you, okay? And then those are actually very valuable data. And so I was giving an example, like say, for example, in this case, right? If you want to get an item list, a list of items, oh, that's very easy, right? You can do it in any tool, okay? Export process can do it, report desk can do it, Crystal and Excel query, they can all do it. And inventory report writer obviously can do it too, okay? But then next, if you say, hey, I want to do a stock status report, especially I have multiple locations. And now, for those of you understand the Elliott database design, the quantity, okay, is in what table? Yeah. Right. So what is the quantity in the item master? The default location, right? Then for all the other location, the quantity is in inventory location file, right? So sometimes you need to get a quantity from the item. Sometimes you need to get a quantity from the inventory location. That's not a relational design. Okay. And now, then you said, okay, Edward, why don't you do something about it, right? We're going to do something about that in version 9, okay? Now, I inherit this because I inherit from Macola, okay? And then Macola inherit from MCBA. And then when the original, the original designer of this, they this is basically how it works, okay? And then I can see how this happened. Basically, originally, MCBA, a mini computer business application. And basically they said, we need to track inventory. So they come up with an item master. They put quantity in there. Sounds good. Single location concept. Maybe at the time, that is sufficient, right? But then later on they said, I need to handle multi-location. Well, my quantity is in the item master, but if I want to handle multi-location, I need to have another table to handle it. They call it IAM inventory location table, but they don't want to disturb the piece, right? Because their primary location quantity has been in the item for a long time. So what do? They create another location for all the other locations quantity, but why still keep the primary location quantity in the item master? Now, by doing that, they resolve a data conversion problem, okay? But by doing that, it make it non-relational. That's basically original how they happen, okay? So that problem was in MCBA and carried to Macola and carried to Elliott today. So then if you want to do a stock seller report for multiple locations, sometimes you get it from the item master, sometimes you get it from the inventory location, you can do it with relational, okay? But it requires some tricks, okay, to do it. And then so that's just one example. But versus on the other hand, if you say, if they get all the quantity in the inventory location table, item master has nothing to do with quantity. If they do that design, then that's a relational. And then it's very easy, okay, for you to do your stock sale report. Okay, and then so these are the example that certain data in Elliott actually is not relational at the moment. So those issues is supposed to be resolved by Elliott version 9. Okay, but for inventory report writer, we don't care. Okay, even though it's not relational, I can just make it available to you. Either way. Okay, so so there's a lot of data easily accessible to you to inventory report writer that's not easily available through Crystal report desk or Excel query. That's basically the point I'm trying to say, okay? So now, time for me to do the demo. So I'm going to do a lot of demo today, how to do certain things. And hopefully I don't, for you to do that, but this is the thing how I like to construct this presentation. I'm a very interactive guy, okay? So if you know what, I don't know how this works. Why it's not responding to me? I just want to do a minimize, and then now this guy is on the top is getting to the way. Now, any expert how to get this screen up so I can minimize the screen? Hover over. Does it? Say that again. Window what? Window D. Thank you. I need to give you a coin. Where's my coin? Okay. We still have a lot of shares, okay? And then so, and don't be shy. Claim your magic coin. Sorry about it, okay. So what is Windows D stand for? D stand for what? Desktop. Windows D desktop. I learned something today. Now, so this is the thing I like to construct my meeting. Can I like to get this go away. Any room? Oh, okay, so you just go away automatically. I don't know how it happened. Man, but so I guess the question is, how do I drag this guy? Without this, with this guy still here, is there any way I can just alt tab? Or no, this is just a shipping focus. But I want this guy to go away. What did I do to make it go down? I don't know how it works. So, okay, but anyway, so this is basically okay. So let me rephrase. Okay, where we were. Okay, we were under inventory management. No, actually, this is Nesson 16 data. I wanted to go to LB data, and then so this is Andre from LB and Sang, and then thanks him for giving me his permission to use his data to do the presentation of this session, and so. In the inventory management under the report section, there's this what we call the reorder device user-defined CSV. There's another one, okay, related to this. It's called the, at the end of the menu structure, it's called the user-defined CSV report. Now, what is the differences? The differences is you can design, okay, in this menu. So usually, is the supervisor, manager, admin people you want to let them have the access. But versus on the other hand, in this one, you are restricted to run and it's subject to security. And then so it's usually the actual person want to run the report and will use this function. Now, so I'm going to go in there and then define something. And then so under the maintenance, and then in the user-defined CSV layout, and then let's take a look. What do I have right now? I have two spec, 998 and 999. That's actually the default one delivered by Elliot, okay? And at the moment, I need to construct a new one. So what I'm gonna do is this. I'm gonna say, I'm gonna add new, okay? I'm gonna call this a spec number one. And I will call it, this is called the stock status report. And then the user ID, well, so, you know, I can assign a user, but I'm not gonna assign a user at the moment. I'm just gonna say this one will go to C, well, actually go to M drive, Elliot A, and I'm gonna go to the report folder. I'm gonna call stock.csv. And what do I need? So they asked me a list of columns, okay, in your spreadsheet. Now, in stock sale report, the first one should start with item number, right? So item, well, this is only 2-digit code. So item number probably start with I maybe. Unlucky. Okay, now description. Item description probably start with a D, right? There's a description one and description two. So I said D1 maybe? Okay. Oh, and then the second one must be D2. Okay. Like you said, oh, Edward, that's not fair. Okay. And then, you know all this code. How do I know, right? So yeah, that's a fair point. And so now I need to have some additional information. So then I want to construct a report that basically maybe if I want to start that report, I need to have the quantity, right? Okay. So let's have a quantity on hand, quantity allocated, quantity on order. That would make sense, right? And I would also probably need to have the cost information. And then I need to have an extended cost. And I would need to calculate the extended cost because you would take the on hand times the unit cost. That's your extended cost. That extended cost actually doesn't exist in Elliott, right? Okay, so I need to calculate it. So how do I do all of this? So first, quantity on hand probably start with a Q, but what is the second digit? So I did that. Okay, now you can all see this, right? F7, search for type. So, man, okay, go away. Okay, so I'm going to do a F7. And so it should start with Q, right? So I can either page down. Oh, well, we are still in the A, okay, so now, the easy way is you can just type Q, okay, so it brings you to the beginning of Q. And then, oh, well, QA quantity allocate, QB back order, QH is a quantity on hand. So I hit enter. Okay. Now, actually, I'm going to make this short. I'm going to say QH. And then I need to have the quantity allocated. So remember F7, and I do a Q. The first one, QA, is quantity allocated. And I'm just going to use allocate is sufficient. And then quantity on order, and then F7, Q, and on order is this guy, QO. Okay, I'm just going to say on order. And then without and then I need a cost. So Andre, you are using what cost? Standard cost. So I'm going to do F7. Standard cost start with S, right? So I would say S. There you go, standard cost. Okay. Sounds good. So now I am missing something. I need an extended cost. So what do I do? And I said, okay, it's really the calculation. So the way how to do it is in our system is we said, okay, it's called formula, okay? And so here they give you some example. You said you do a formula and then you can do the calculation and then by using your arithmetic, etc., those kind of things. This is similar like Excel, except you don't need to do an equal sign because you already say you are formula. So the equal sign is assumed. So then now, but I want to remind you that, okay, unfortunately, this is when we originally designed it, we made a mistake, okay? This year, the maximum is only 12 digits. So you cannot really make your formula too fancy, okay? In this case, what I need to do is I need to take the quantity on hand, which is column number 4, times my standard cost, which is column number 7. So I need to do a C4 and times C7. Does everybody follow that? Okay. And I'm going to call this extended cost. Okay. That's the end. Save the spreadsheet. Okay. So After that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try it. And I'm going to go to print user-defined CSV. And I'm going to say, okay, what's the spec? Okay. And spec is number one. If I don't know, I can hit F7 to search. Okay, so it's spec number one. And it can ask you a starting item, ending item, etc. But instead of doing that, I like to maybe do it by product category. Okay. So Andre, I started your data, yesterday. And then so I know you have a U95, U98. That's the two main category for you, right? Because this is the two, main OEM. So let's start with U95.
Yeah.
U95. Okay, so what will happen is it will give you a report, but this report is not what you want, because what you want is an Excel spreadsheet. Now, the reason you still get a report is basically every sim printing, we need to give you something, okay, in order to make it as a printing. So this report is not important, okay, but we just need to minimize it. And then now, this is the important thing. Oh, CSV is created. Would you like to launch it? I said, yes. All right. So this is my stock sale report. And then now, except the, is Roger here? No, Roger is not here. Okay. But anyway, I'm going to steal one of his thunder. Okay. And you guys see the item number is not big enough, right? So you need to adjust this color. But there's a better way to do it, okay? The better way to do it is to just adjust this column automatically to fit the best size, okay? And then most of you already probably know it, okay? And I want to give to, hey, Roger, I'm going to steal your thunder here, okay, on the auto fit, okay? And then, but just so you know, okay, it was original I'm going to give it to him. and so there's a thing in the Excel spreadsheet. You can make every column just fit right, okay? It's actually, in our report desk, right? Whenever you use our report desk to print something, you can print to the CSV, you can print to Excel, right? So when we print to the CSV, you bring up a CSV, you look at a column, you say, the size is not right, okay? So what do we do with Excel? We print to the CSV, and then we said, that's starter Excel. And then that's use the Excel capability to do the auto fit. And then Excel do the auto fit. And then, there you go, that's our spreadsheet. But we did a little bit more other things, okay? And then, but Excel has a capability called auto fit. And now, I want you guys to know the answer. Raise your hand how to do auto fit. Now, let's see. Okay. How about Luis? You say that again? Double click on the column heading, like this one. And then what do you do? Right. How do I auto fit everything? How to highlight it all? Okay. And then just click on any column. Okay, this is called auto fit. Okay. Now, if you don't know this, this is a lifesaver. All right. So this is my stock sale report. Okay, I just created with the inventory report right there or the user-defined CSV. All right. So I'm all set on this one. Now, the problem here is this, okay? Is I have this on hand, okay, 37. So I'm going to do the Control C. I'm going to go to the earlier, and I'm going to go to inquiry, stock sellers inquiry, and how do I stop that? Oh, it has two locations. Of course, you know, it doesn't matter right now because the allocation is 0, right? So then it begs the question is say this 37. I didn't specify location, so what is this 37? It's both, right? Okay. So, but I want to have a breakdown, right? So what do I do to get a breakdown? No, don't say. Okay. Now, in order to get a breakdown, you need to go to this spec number 1, and I need to probably, okay, go to column 4, okay? And I need to insert a column. So I'm gonna do, now, watch this formula, right? This is C4 times C7, right? So if I do a F7, I'm sorry, if I do an insert line is F1. So I do the F1. Did you guys notice that the formula at the bottom, you said now C5 times the CA? You adjust it automatically, okay? Now, and then right now, what I need to do is I need to have a location column. And what is location column? Location start with a L, right? So F7L, location. And location, yeah, there you go. Now, so if I run this report again, thank you. Okay. Say that again. You can search. Yeah. Can I so more than one? Let me see. Can I say location 1? Hey, location 2. There you go. I think we can specify up to 10 locations, if I'm not mistaken. And actually, okay, Andre, maybe you're aware of this. Include or exclude category. I can say, hey, how about include category? How's that different than starting ending? I'm gonna do a U95. I can do another category called U98. And I can keep on entering. I can enter up to 10 category. So I can have 10 category and then 10 location. All right. One more time. And launch the CSV. And let's do the auto fit. All right. So most of them are all in location 2. Now, but did you guys notice that this item actually was stuck in both location 2 and location 1, right? But I didn't print location 1. But this item is stuck in both location 1 and location 2. But both location printed. Why? Uh, right, exactly. You use the report right, inventory report right now? Do you? Yeah, that's a good answer. So there's a feature in the system, and the feature in the system is basically saying that if you want to print a line, everything is zero, why bother? You know, and then it is one of the, if you guys look at earlier, the flag is there's something called the number 18. Okay, I'm not gonna print this one, but let's do this include U95 and U98. Question number 8 is print item with all zero, yes or no? By default, it's no. So we evaluate a design, and on that design, you have a whole bunch of quantity on hand field. And then if all your quantity on hand is zero, then we just say, well, it makes no good sense to print it, right? Then we can suppress it. And then, but if you want to override that rule, you can say yes. Okay, but by default is no. So as a result, what happened is, even though you have two locations, but we only print location 2 because location 1 has no interesting information to show. But this one, yes, we have interesting information to show for both. So then this is basically your stock style report for both locations right now. Yes.
I noticed that two quantity is zero, but is it print because there's a quantity allocated in the quantity?
Right, because they are quantity 2, right? You're talking about this guy?
But even though it's quantity 0.
Right.
Well, maybe it's
no, it's because of this and this, right? Because they are quantity 2, so so we show it, right? So but let's say suppose if I eliminate these 2 columns, right? And then it said, oh, you only want quantity on hand, and it is 0, be eliminated. Okay, that's the idea behind that. Okay, so all right, so let's get back to our original demo. Okay, and then so what we learned from this particular example is how do you search the column, and when in the F7 search window, type in the first character, and then we'll get you located to the area of those columns quickly. And then how to use this formula. And what is the limitation? The limitation is, well, the field size is not very big, so you cannot do fancy formula. And we will address this limitation in version 9. And then how do you add a new column? So you go to a place, you hit F1, you insert a new column, and then remember the formula column get recalculated automatically. And then and then what happens is when you have a location column without a location column, without a location column, we combine the quantity and of all location. If you have a location column, then we show the individual location as an individual line. Okay, that's what we learned in this particular one. So next, okay, is useful information that you will get out of just not just the quantity on hand, but you're saying that if I want to plan my purchasing for the future, it would be nice to know what is my sales situation, right? So that's something good to know, okay? So I want to add the sales information into into the report. And so let's do that, okay? And I remember this is a Windows D desktop. All right, so I need to go to this guy. I need to go to maintenance, user-defined CSV, and first, I don't want to modify my report I designed earlier. Remember, earlier I did a 1, right? I want to preserve that one. So I want to create a 2, but I don't want to starting from scratch. So what I do is, in this case, is I do a copy. I copy from 1 and to 2, and I call this stock with sales history and stock and history.csv. Okay, so it's copy. Now I go to the change. I change my 2. And so at this moment, I need to add more sales information. So let's do, now I'm more interested in quantity sold because I'm more interested in how many I should purchase. So I'm not interested in sales amount, I'm interested in quantity amount, right? So I do a F7 and quantity sold. Let's probably starting with a Q, right? So Q, okay, so I have a quantity allocated back order. Quantity sold in image history, that's interesting, but that's not what I want. Now, oh, I'm interested in this one. Okay, now, quantity sold versus quantity sold in invoice history. What is the differences? Okay, now you look at the bottom, right? Quantity sold, as I highlighted, here it said quantity sold is the location history quantity sold aggregated total for the period. Now, but it's coming from location history, I know that. Now, this one, quantity sold in invoice history. And it is the invoice history quantity sold supported by the customer or type, okay? So it implies that quantity sold, if I choose quantity sold, and then that means I will, that means I will go to the inventory location history file to get it. And then it has a nice 12 bucket, and I can get that data very easily, no cost, basically, okay, no performance issue. But if I get the quantity sold in invoice history does not have that data readily available. I need to calculate it, okay? So as a result, it will take more time for the QI to work, okay? But there are some advantage in some situation. You may want to use the QI instead of a QS, but at the moment, we're only interested in quantity sold from the location history, which I can get it really quick. And so I'm gonna say it, and then he asked me, say, oh, okay, what is the period from when to when, right? So from what period to what period? Let's say I want to know what is my total quantity sold in the in the last 12 months, not including this month. What do I do? So that will be from this is my current period, October. I really need the data to September, right? So I need to have the from October, okay, 2022 to September 2023, right? That's what I need, right? So October is the current period. So I'm going to say it's the CP. I'm sorry. Now this is IP phone, okay, it's wonderful, okay, and you can just work from anywhere. Now, so the so October is the current period, okay, and then the year is last year, right? So I said current period last year to my prior period, okay? Prior period is September is a prior period. So prior period is PP. PP must be what? Oh, last period, I'm sorry, not prior period, last period. I need to go to last period and to the current year, CY. Now you can also enter the year, okay, directly. If you want to enter the period, the year directly, the number directly, you could do that, but that make your design not very flexible. Because what if you go to the next period, next month, where your spreadsheet continue to work, right? And then so that will be your challenge, okay? So then, so he said, okay, quantity so for all customers, this is another interesting subject. We'll come back and later, okay? So I'm gonna say, oh yeah, this is quantity so 1 year. All right. But I also want to have some refined data. So I want to know the quantity I sold in the maybe for this year from January, February, each month, give me the bucket. So I want to see the sales trend, right? But enter that is too much, you know, because this is the demo. So I just want to enter full period. Okay, and so I want to do a QS again. And I want to say that's from the period 1 to the current year to period 03, current year. And I want to say quantity, so first QTR and quantity, so and from 04 CY to 06 CY. And I said this is a quantity, so second quarter. Oh, I'm sorry. You know, my typing is terrible, okay, and quarter, and then number 13, and quantity so, and this is from 07 current year to 09 current year, and I'm gonna say quantity so third quarter, and then lastly quantity so and 09 well 10 CY 12 CY and quantity so fourth quarter. Oh, so I'm done. Let me try it. Print and spec number 2. And including category U95 and U98. Now, in this case, okay, Okay, we'll show you another thing I need to adjust. Now, okay, this is a sign. Now, create a CSV. All right. Well, the spreadsheet is a little bit wide and then extend to the right side. Okay, and so, but let's look at that. And then so it has the period one, right? It has the location one, right? Except location one. Location one is not really a location I'm selling from. So, so location one doesn't really need to be in this spreadsheet. Andre, right? You never sell from location one, right? Yeah, you will never sell from location one because location one is a transit location, right? Is that what it is? Okay. And so since you will never sell from location one, why do I want to bother with the location one if it's from a history point of view, right? So then this is basically what you do, okay, is when you print this report, say spec 2, and then you say include. Let's include U95, U98, and then there is this question saying that would you like to print in detail or summary? Detail, that basically meaning for each location you're going to print a line. But versus summary, it will only print one line per item. So which is that's what I want. I am more interesting without really the location. Now, yeah. Okay. Now, you can notice earlier there was a location column between the C and D, right? It's being eliminated because I said I want to print summary. And then so it's intelligent enough to adjust the column list because we say summary, so there's no need for location. And then and this quantity is basically, but except I'm not happy with this report because why? Because all this column is too long. And the reason it's too long is the column heading, I am naming it too long. And so when I do the auto fit, okay, even though the data is really not that big, but the column heading is long. So the auto fit has to consider the column heading. So what do I do is right now is I go back to my spec and I change my spec number 2. I need to fix the column heading because my column heading is too long. So I am going to changing this call quantity, so I'm going to make it QS. Okay. And this one, I'm going to say QS. One quarter, first quarter. Make it really short. QS 2Q. QS 3Q. And this one, I'm going to make it QS 4Q. And save it. And then I will print it one more time. My spec 2 and include, and then U95 and U98. And then I want to say this is going to be summary. Not interested in this guy, but I'm interested in the spreadsheet. All right, so now if I do a auto fit, this is much better, right? So what is the lesson of this? The lesson of this is name your column heading short. Because when you auto fit, your column likely will stay small. You can see a lot more information, okay, with your spreadsheet by doing it this way. Now, I am also going to say, like some of my customers had some major customer, and they said, I'm interested to know this item sold to customer A, how many? Customer B, how many, etc. Right? So, well, but this is not a good example because I know in LB situation, the product category, the U95, that's a Caterpillar parts, right? And then Caterpillar parts only sell to Caterpillar. And then U98 is John Deere. John Deere part only sell to John Deere. So it's not a good example. But let's just say, supposedly, imagine this part is generic. You can sell to multiple customers. Then you like to know how many this item sold is due to customer A and how many is due to customer B. I like to know that, right? So if you want to know that, then how do I do it? Okay. So I will show you how to do that. Okay. And so let's close this guy. So first, it will make sense for me to change the spec to probably including the product category field. So I'm going to go to field number 5. I'm going to do an insert, and I will say this is going to be my product category. Not sure, but product category start with P. So there you go. PC is the product category. And we say cat, okay? This is the reason why we make all this column heading so short, as I explained the reason. Now, so I need to go to field number 16. I need to have a quantity sold for John Deere and QS. Now, so I want to see the 1 year data. So I just duplicated CPLY, LPCY, and I would say QS, QS year for, what is a John Deere customer? I'm sorry, Caterpillar. Caterpillar is what? C5060? C. Oh, well, why don't I just say cat? Okay, well, actually, I defined it wrong. Because earlier, okay, when he asked me, quantity sold for all customer, right? I need to say, no, it's not for all customer. And no, actually, I should say it's actually for one customer only. So I need to say this is for one customer only. I say C. And what's the customer? Well, I can search now, but Andre just told me it's C5060. 0560. Okay, so that's a quantity sold for cat. Then I need to add another column, quantity sold. And this is basically for the current period last year to the last period of current year. So I'm going to say this is quantity sold year for John Deere. Well, actually, I didn't do it right because I need to say any change. I need to say yes. This is for one customer only. And John Deere customer is J5000, right? So I will do a print. Use it. Yes. Yes, I can choose customer type. Current customer type. You're correct on that. And you can actually do another thing. It's called customer groups. Ah, I'm glad you asked. Okay. You can make multiple customer type, group them together as a customer groups. And it's select by customer group. Okay. Now, do you guys notice this is slower this time? Why is this so much slower? Because it has to calculate history, because you cannot get from the location history for how many you sold for John Deere and Caterpillar. It has to go to the detail to get that number. So now it is slow down a little bit because I specify for the customer. Actually, okay, I'm reading for the inventory transaction, audit trail file. Okay, but I could read it from the invoice history too. But invoice history is not the best way to get that data. Okay, yes. Yes, it has a quantity usage as our quantity sold. That's part of the IN location history table. It differentiates usage versus the sold. Now, so like in this case, okay, okay, so like in this case, this guy, right? So the year to date is 1,503, but for Caterpillar it's only 1,439. So there's still some discrepancy. So the things you sold to Caterpillar, not necessarily everything go to C0560, right? Right. So I guess that's the main customer for Caterpillar. So then how do I get all the customer? So then supposedly for Caterpillar, so maybe if you make Caterpillar as a customer type, right? Then you can select by customer type. Okay. And the whole reason that there's a customer group is because is one of my customer, they create too many customer type. And then someone they said, I like to group some of the customer type together. So then we just go one level higher and then we create a customer group. That's the reason for that. Okay. So as you can see, this is U95, right? U95, that's a John Deere, that's a Caterpillar part. U98, that's a Caterpillar part, right? So that's basically how it works. Okay. Now, so you guys want to take a break shortly? Maybe that's a good idea because this is a long presentation. Let's take a break for 5 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
There. So in the previous session, okay, and we went through the following, and then by now you should know how you can copy from an existing design, okay, to a new one, and then also how do you add the sales history for each period, and then why you should make the column short, right? Because when you do the best fit on the spreadsheet, your column heading is not going to get into the way. And then you can also add the sales history limited to only a certain customer type. And actually, I just mentioned that you can do a customer group as well. Now, so next, I'm going to talk about an example of an EDI 846 inventory advice. And the primary purpose of this one is related to EDI, obviously, okay? And then if you say you need to work with your partner, and then they need to have your update inventory. And then usually the practice is throughout the day, each day you was several times, maybe one time in the morning, one time in the noon, and one time in the afternoon, something like that. You will export your inventory data, including your quantity on hand allocated, and that basically meaning your availability. And then you will export that data, and that data is then basically, become EDI 846 transmitted to your trading partner. Then your trading partner has the update data, and then they can sell it, okay, based on your up-to-date data. Now, it's not perfect because sometimes, during this period, and your inventory changes, and then so the customer may buy from, your e-retail website, and then when it comes to you, and then you don't have it available. That's possible, okay? But but just speaking, for most of the part, even though it's not real time, but majority of the situation it works. So and then so you can export the data through the export processor. You can also export that data through what we call the user-defined CSV. And I guess it is also possible in the future. Maybe we can even using a report desk to do this. Okay, but the good thing about the user-defined CSV is the data is more complete. Okay, in user-defined CSV or inventory report writer, and but this is an export processor. It contains most of the data, but some of the data might not be all available. And also, user-defined CSV, you can defer it, right? So then you can just let it run automatically at a certain scheduled period of time. And so this is take place automatically. There's no need for intervention. The export processor, it doesn't have a deferred processing capability, but what has happened is people has using what we call the window scheduler, okay, and then the export process actually is very interesting because you can call it from a command prompt, and then if you passing enough parameter information into the export processor, you can actually just run, and then without going through the user interface. So so some people do the automation of export processors through Windows Scheduler. Okay, and then so that's an option. But today we're going to talk about how to handle the EDI 846 through the user-defined CSV. And then we have a knowledge base article on our website. And basically every single new feature we introduce, we will have an article associated with it, so you can find a lot of information there. And then, so this is the example number one. And then we can implement the EDI 846 layout by doing it this way. And I'm just going to basically duplicate this. And maybe it's going to be a little bit boring. And then there's another example. This is the example 2. Now, the difference between these two examples is that how we get the data, and this one get the data from attribute, and instead of getting from, like this one is getting from the inventory quantity directly. And then there's a reason behind that. And then the reason is technical, okay, so I'm not going to get into the detail. And also, in our, remember we work with the EDI through the ESS, right? earlier SPS services, okay? So ESS can also do something. And then so when we send the information to SPS, we first take a look of the inventory data, you send it to us, and then we can set out a rule. And in this case, if you look at there's somewhere the rule in the middle, okay, you see this line, E846 UDC Q quantity less than map to 0. Now, as you can see, it doesn't show my cursor here, right? Okay, you guys are not seeing my cursor. So what that line means, when we process this data for 846 by UDC stands for user-defined code. By user-defined code, if the quantity is less than a certain number, we want to tell the retailer we have 0. That's ideal. So then you see the first entry says C4, vertical 4, right? So it means in this UDC, if the code is a C4, and then if it's less equal than 4, then tell the other guy, I have nothing available. That's the entry. And then you can keep on repeating this entry. And then C54, C74, P04, and there's some other item that, oh, the last one, comma, and then no value, but vertical 10. That's basically catch for all. It's basically everybody in the previous user-defined code, and the rule is 4. But for everybody else that doesn't qualify for this user-defined code, and then the rule is 10, meaning that if you're less than 10, we're gonna count in, we have 0 available. So this is the type of things that you can set up, okay, in the ESS as far as how you control the quantity and then tell the vendor, okay, now, or the trading partner. Now, I know you guys need to do 846 because you guys work with a retailer, right? Kingston Press need to work with retailer. Anybody here work with a e-retailer at the moment? No? Okay. Okay. So so in this demo, okay, we're gonna show you something, but that's talk about later. Why don't I just do the demo? And so again, Again, to begin, I don't want to override my existing design. So I use probably my number one design and I copy to number 3. I call this EDI A46. Okay, export. All right. So I change it, my spec number 3. And so, well, they don't need my location information, so I'm going to delete it. And so to delete it, I just simply press space key. And it will ask me, say, you want to delete? Yes. And I need my quantity on hand. I need my quantity allocated. And well, actually, I need a UPC code. But so after the description too, I need a UPC code. Except, Andre, you don't have a UPC code. So what do? I had set F1, and I use something called a constant. C is, no, actually, C is not constant. So what is constant? Okay, so F7, C, constant is CV, constant value, okay? So, well, what's a constant value? I don't know. I mean, I don't have a value, so what is the best way? Don't say anything, okay? And I call this column called UPC, which is mean I have nothing, okay? Now, then I need a quantity on hand. I need a quantity allocated. I don't need quantity on order. So I go to field number 7, and it want my quantity on order, but it wants something. It wants the first day that you will have the quantity on order coming. So the idea behind the e-retailer is basically this, okay? Now, if you have on hand, right, they say, okay, I can sell it. But if you don't have on hand, when are you gonna have it? They want to see your PO. But they are not interested to see all your PO, they're interested to know your first PO that will receive, right? So I cannot get it from quantity on order because quantity on order is an aggregate number for all my PO. So I need to know my first PO. So so this is something interesting in the system. Okay, so I will show you. Okay, and so this is called the actual code is starting with 1. Okay, it's called the first pending receiving 1Q. Okay, and then I would simply call this quantity order. Well, which is not true. It's only the first PO that I shall receive. And then on what day you will have it. Because the e-retailer not only interested in, you don't have it, right? So where's the next time? Okay, you will have the quantity. And so you need to provide them the quantity, you need to provide them with the date. And then so this one, if I do F7, is called the 1D, the first pending receiving date. Okay, is I call this say quantity available. Okay, then I also need to have something like I'm just gonna copy this activity code, okay, which is that active or is that, obsolete, etc.? I need a product category. So product category is called PC, stands for product category, and I need inventory class 11, which is 11 inventory class is IC. You need an inventory class for something, okay? Is that an ABC? Inventory class refer to the ABC class. And then I need a user defined code. I call UC. And I need I need a union measure. So UN. And I need a selling union measure just in case that the selling union measure is different than the stocking union measure. So SU stands for selling union measure. And number 15 is and then I need to know whether this is a purchase manufacturer or is a kit or feature product. So is number 16 is a PM code. I think I'm missing something. That item no quantity on hand allocated PD activity code. Yeah. Oh, I missed the ratio. Okay, so number 15. I need to press F1. I need to say this is called a selling ratio. Okay, that's all I want. So let's run this one. This is 3. And same thing, I want to get my data from the include U95 and U98. All right, so here's my data. Well, this one, why it doesn't adjust? Interesting. Okay, so, oh, I know why. Because, just right. Okay, so you see some of these items, right? It said, okay, it's going to be available on January 24, 2024. And we will have 1,134 pieces coming, okay? This data coming from an area we call ATP. ATP stands for available to promise, okay? And then, which is the next section I'm gonna talk about is what is ATP? And ATP can be very important to you. And but I'm just going to not get into the detail of ATP, but just talk about how, just to give you an example of what is that, okay? And then so in this example, and for this item, and I'm gonna copy it. And I'm gonna go to this stock status. Okay. You see the quantity order is 4,536 pieces, right? But there is a way to drill down to see the detail. So that's called an F3 key, ATP inquiry. So if I hit F3, and then I see, oh, I have a lot of information. But this is kind of a little bit cluttering. And then so I don't want to see all this detail, and I see hit F3. I don't only want to see the actual data. Okay, so this is my first PO receiving, 1,134 pieces, and it's going to arrive on January 24th. 24. And that's what this represents. This type of data, if you're trying to get it from Crystal Report, Excel query, it's almost impossible to get. Okay, but you can get it through the inventory report writer. Now, so with this previous lesson, so what do we get out of it? We get that you can use the constant value, but in this case, I just basically need to have an extra column with blank value. And then so you can say, okay, how to use a 1Q, okay, and then the column, and what is a 1D column, and then instead of using quantity and order, you use the first day of your next schedule receiving, okay? And next, I'm going to show you an item batch. So in the previous example, okay, I have always basically saying that, give me the list, right? That's either U95, U90A. You can have a selecting a list of category, but what if they say, I am interested in a certain few items. I'm interested in those items. They are not part of a category, not part of a user-defined code. But I know who they are. And can I just get those data, right? So in our system, we have a way to handle that. We call batch. And then so the way how the batch works is you need to first be able to, you first need to be able to create a list. And now let me go bring up that list. I think I put the list in the Android earlier A, and then I was putting to the report folder. And I have the E80 fix CSV. So, well, let's say I am interested in this, all this 040 item, okay? And there's no way for me to use any filter criteria to select them. So I'm just not going to copy them. And I will create a new text file. I call this 040.txt. And in this 040.txt, I would include a list of items, any item that you like, randomly, okay? So I create this list of items, and I'm gonna save it. And then the next things I'm gonna do is I will go back to this guy, and I will create a CSV batch. And this CSV batch, I'm gonna call this 040. Oh, batch already on fire. Okay, I haven't cleaned my data. Very good, okay. Right, okay, well, that was my trial run last night, but I didn't wipe it out, okay, all of them. But anyway, this is pointing to a 040 text. So you create a batch, and this batch pointing to the CSV file you want. And then I go to print, I said this is going to be my spec number 3, and I would want to use a batch. So instead of starting ending item number, I can hit my F4 key here. F4 equal enter batch. So I hit F4, and so okay. So what is your batch? So the batch is 0, 4, 0. And then now you notice that it skipped location, it skipped product category, it skipped all this selection. Why? Because your selection is based on the list in the item, right? The 040.txt. So there's no reason for you to do those selection, but it asks you only a few parameter, okay? Like, do you want to print cost or not? And but just speaking, you skip all the selection field. And now we can run it. Anybody know why this happened? Because I still have this open. So I need. So one more time, 3 and 040. All right, so now you see very fast, right? This is actually is almost take no time to do it because you already provide this item. It can do it very quickly. Yes?
I didn't see where you.
Okay. It's called batch.
Yep.
User-defined CSV batch. I will need to define a batch. In this case, I call it 040 batch. In this 040 batch, you specify what is your batch file name and path. So in this example, you mean the file? Then it will just fail, right? No, I think first it will say, does the batch exist or not, right? And if the batch exists, it will let you proceed. I don't believe it will say, okay, you enter the batch, but does the CSV file specified in the batch exist or not? I don't think it would do that, okay? But instead, what will happen is as long as the batch exists, it will let you proceed. But at the time of execution, and it will go look for the file, and if the file does not exist, and then I believe it will just fail the execution and then abort. I think that's what. Okay. So so in this item batch, right? So what did we learn? We said item batch is a list of items that can be used as a selection instead of a normal filter parameter. And in some of the situations, the list of items you are interested in, you cannot select by item number range, you cannot select by product category range, you cannot select by any of those filter criteria we provide, right? So, well, then in that case, you create a list yourself. There's quite a few interfaces in our system, like I know in the BOM module, okay, BOMP, the production work order module, in many different places, for example, I think like the gross requirement, exactly. In the gross requirement, you can enter the item one by one, right? And then, but instead of enter item one by one, you can just hit a key and select the TXT file. And then that TXT file contains all the items you want. And then you just add those items into your gross requirement for you. Yes, exactly. So that's another example. So you can have a list of order number. So in the gross requirement, say, I like to do my gross requirement analysis against this sales order number. Okay, so that's generally speaking, a common interface in some other different places. And then so to use it, you create a TXT file, and then basically each one of a row containing an item number, and then you create a batch and then point into this TXT file. And then when you run this user-defined CSV, and then in the item field you press F4, then you enter the batch, and then there you go. Okay. And okay, so the next subject I'm going to talk about ATP. Okay, and then we're actually running out of time, but I probably won't do the demo. Okay, and then but I just want to talk about the ATP, and there's two types of business. One type of business, depending on how they basically replenish their stock, they can replenish the stock by forecasting. And the forecasting is based on the past sales history, and then plus their knowledge of the reasonable seasonal, trend, etc. Right? So then they can basically come up with their forecast, and then based on the forecast, then we'll say this is how many I need to purchase. Okay, how many I need to produce, etc. Now the other type of business, okay, is you will say I will not produce anything or purchase anything unless I have the order, okay? And then so this is called purchase or manufacture to order. And usually if it's larger business, okay, and then they would do purchase or manufacture to stock, they need to do forecasting. But if you are, not those top dogs, okay, etc. And then you want to make sure that you don't overproduce and then over purchase, right? And then your business can be in trouble if you have a lot of inventory you cannot sell. And then so then usually you would do a purchase or manufacture to order. So now this particular example, like LB and Sub, okay, and then is the example of a purchase or manufacture to order. Mostly, okay. I do know some of your stock, you may stock it, right? But the bulk of your business is purchase or manufacture to order, because you work with a company like a John Deere, Caterpillar, and then they have a production schedule. Their production schedule will tell you, say, I expect you give me this many parts, okay, and on this day, that day, etc. They will give you an order way ahead. So then you can plan, okay, your purchasing or manufacturing accordingly. And then so this is another type of the business, okay? So this is two different types, right? So for purchase or manufacture to stock, right, sales history is important. But for purchase or manufacture to order, your ATP information is critical. What is ATP? Okay, ATP is available to promise, and it is a database of all the future activity, including the replenish data, requirement data. When I say replenish, meaning quantity coming in, right? The quantity can come in if you make a PO, or if you make a production for a parent item, the quantity can come in, or requirement like a sales order. You need to sell it to your customer that's going out, right? And then, or if you want to produce something, you have to have a component to produce it. So those components are requirement. And then so this database merge all this data together of your future activity, and then by item, and then you can list the item and then look at its availability to check the future quantity balance. So you have on hand, and then basing on this on hand, and then you can say, okay, this is what I'm gonna have in the future, okay? Whenever you have a negative quantity, and then it's a problem. And then so then the planner should do something, okay? And then and then you need to make sure your future quantity balance is not negative. And then that's basically the planner's job, okay? And some of you know there is something called a MRP. MRP stands for Material Requirement Planning, okay? ATP is a real-time MRP. No kidding. Okay, and then so the ATP is much better than NLRP. That's what I can tell you. Okay, and then so that's something in the system, and then so now I am giving an example of one of the item, and then so this item is an item we need to produce. Okay, and then we have the requirement, and then but this requirement is kind of like in the future, right? And then so John Deere basically saying that in January 22nd, 2024, I need 120 pieces from you. And so either you need to buy it or you need to produce it. So Andre, in this case, this is a manufactured item. Am I right? Okay. So then what happened next is then this particular manufactured item, right, is you can see so this particular manufactured item, I'm only show what we call the actual transaction. And then the next slide, I am showing the planning transaction. The actual transaction is something that you commit already. Somebody give you a sales order, that's a commitment. You place a purchase order, that's a commitment. You create a work order, that's a commitment. And then, but you can also have a planning transaction. Planning transaction is inside Elia, which is basically saying that, well, this is not real yet, but the computer suggests maybe you should consider placing an order at a particular time. So then your future inventory is not going to fall into negative. So in this case, okay, on the bottom right, okay, this is the planning transaction. And then so because the planning transaction of 120, and what will happen is where you need to sell this 120 to John Deere on the 22nd, okay, you will have enough to cover. And it will actually give you another 3 days to prepare for that. That's a buffer day, right? So we want you to come in a little bit earlier to get prepared. So you will have 120 3 days ahead. So then 3 days later, you will ship to John Deere. So all these 120, 120, 120, 120, 120, they are all planning. LP is a planning ATP transaction. So system created automatically. The LP planning, it can plan for as a work order, it can planning as a purchasing. And then what the ATP system does is if you agree with what the ATP say, you can convert this planning into a work order or into purchasing. So system can do all of that and automate the processing for the planner, okay? And I believe we are kind of running out of time. So original, I'm going to do a demo, okay? And then, but what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna show you a knowledge base article and what you can do. And then so if you go to the, I'm gonna make this a little bit smaller, okay? Because say that again? The planning, right. So this is a knowledge-based article on how to use the user-defined CSV to handle ATP, right? So it's basically the stuff I'm talking about here. And because I don't have the time to do the demo, and then, but you can follow this along, okay? And then the purpose of this spreadsheet is this, okay? Is once you export your data, right, of your future ATP data to the spreadsheet, And then you look at it, and then it does not particularly stand out. But remember, all this is week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 8, whatever. This is just basically the weekly bucket as far as what is your quantity balance. You need to look for those weeks that your quantity is negative, right? So you look at this spreadsheet, it doesn't particularly stand out, but I can say, oh, you see that this is a negative, right? Negative 10. And oh, you see this is some negative here, right? But it's not easy for you to see. But this is the great thing about spreadsheet. So in the spreadsheet, you can just basically say that, show me all the negative as a red, right? Once you do that, and then in your spreadsheet, all the negatives show up. And then these are the items, and then when you have time, you need to address it. So then make sure that you don't have a shortage. Okay, so this is a great tool to do all that. And then so that's basically the end of my presentation. And then any questions so far? Okay, let's take a break.